Okay.
And I have all these footnotes.
Okay, folks, I believe we are, well, I don't believe, we are starting. So here we are, I'm declaring it. Welcome to the second panel of the day. My name is Tony Alessandrini. I teach English at Kingsborough Community College and in the Middle Eastern Studies program here at the GC. I'm also a proud member of the Committee on Globalization and Social Change. And I'm really happy to be moderating this panel with two scholars whose work I have been following and who both actually have books whose arrival is imminent that I think will be really important for a number of fields. I wasn't here for the beginning of the last panel, but maybe it makes sense just to introduce Gavin first, and then we'll do your paper, and then I'll introduce Fatih. Right? So let me just, without further ado, go ahead and introduce Gavin Arnell, who is Assistant Professor of Spanish at the University of Michigan. His research and teaching interests converge at the intersection of aesthetics, politics, and philosophy, like many of us in this room, I think, with a specialization in modern and contemporary Latin America and the Caribbean. He also works on the history of Marxism, the philosophy of translation, competing notions of what constitutes universality, indigenous and African diaspora studies, avant-garde poetry and film, and critical theory. His soon-to-be-published first book, quite soon, yes? We hope. We're waiting for it. We are waiting for it. We're waiting for it. It's a book called Subterranean Fanon, and having had the chance to hear parts of it, Gavin present parts of it, it's going to be very exciting. So it maps an underground current of non-dialectical thought in Fanon's writings. His next book, Translating Universality, explores how, you're going to forgive my Spanish here, Jose Carlos Murrieta and Jose Maria Arguedas conceptualized Marxism, indigenous culture, and their encounter. He's the co-editor of a couple of forthcoming volumes. One is called Theory, Translation, Universality, Contemporary Debates. And the second is called Between Revolution and Democracy, Jose Rico, I should have gone there. Jose Rico, Marxism and Latin America. He's also the translator of a book by Emilio de Ipola, which has come out with Duke University Press as Althusser, The Infinite Farewell, published last year. And he has ongoing projects, which include the rethinking of the history of surrealism in Latin America. I think there was an article on Cortázar recently, yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Latin America and the Caribbean, and attending to the legacy and the continued reverberations of the Haitian Revolution. And the title of his talk today is Marxism as Translation. So I turn it over to Gavin Arnell.
Well, thank you so much to everyone, to Gary for the invitation, which is really fantastic. I've been admiring both near and from afar the work that's being done here, both in terms of its theory, its scholarship, but also in terms of its politics. So I'm very happy to be a part of it today. I also wanted to thank Lindsay for her organizational work, who has helped make this conference possible, to Tony for the kind introduction, to all of you for being here. I want to begin the talk with two epigraphs. The first is from an essay by Jörg Lukács, What is Orthodox Marxism?, which is the first essay in what's probably his most famous book, History and Class Consciousness. The excerpt comes right at the beginning of the essay, so I take it as sort of a programmatic statement for not only that essay, but for the book that follows. He writes, "Let us assume for the sake of argument that recent research had disproved once and for all every one of Marx's individual theses. Even if this were to be proved, every serious orthodox Marxist would still be able to accept all such modern findings without reservation, and hence dismiss all of Marx's theses in toto, without having to renounce his orthodoxy for a single moment. Orthodox Marxism, therefore, does not imply the uncritical acceptance of the results of Marx's investigations. It is not the belief in this or that thesis, nor the exegesis of a sacred book. On the contrary, orthodoxy refers exclusively to method." The second epigraph is from an early article Antonio Gramsci wrote. so before he was imprisoned and before the more well-known prison notebooks, titled The Revolution Against Capital. Gramsci writes, "The Bolshevik Revolution is a revolution against Karl Marx's capital. The Bolsheviks are not Marxist, in scare quotes. They have not used the master's works to compile a rigid doctrine made up of dogmatic and unquestionable claims. They are living out Marxist thought." So with that, I'll begin. Since the 2008 world economic crash, communism has experienced a resounding comeback in contemporary theoretical debates. To mention just a few examples from a growing list of recent publications on the topic, we could recall Alain Badiou's The Communist Hypothesis, Jody Dean's The Communist Horizon, Bruno Bastille's The Actuality of Communism, and the 3 edited volumes on the idea of communism, which collecting the papers of conferences held in London, New York, and Seoul. Over the past decade, socialism has likewise enjoyed a surge in popularity, even to the extent of becoming a buzzword in mainstream electoral politics through figures like Bernie Sanders, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and Rashida Tlaib. And yet, the third ism of this series, Marxism, is often still regarded as naming something irredeemably outdated, passé, archaic. In Bastille's words, quote, "The least that may be said today about Marxism is that its mere mention has become an unmistakable sign of obsolescence," end quote. The irony of this rather widespread sentiment is that it hinges on a misunderstanding of what Marxism is at its core, as if it were a doctrinaire school of thought with a set of rigid beliefs inherited from a distant time in the past, and not an experimental form of theory and practice that has inscribed in itself a conception of its own continual transformation in response to the emergence of new historical conditions. Despite their various differences, Lukács and Gramsci agree on this aspect of Marxism's nature. The kind of Marxism that treats Marxist theses as sacred and timeless axioms is not really Marxism at all. Marxism, on the contrary, entails living out Marxist thought, contributing to an inner revolution in Marxism itself as part of a broader movement aimed at transforming the world. The orthodox Marxist is someone who repeats Marx, but not in the sense of rehearsing the same arguments or ardently defending the theses of capital, but rather in the sense of practicing the same method, what Lenin called the living soul of Marxism, the concrete analysis of a concrete situation. It follows that the true Marxist is not a Marxist, that orthodox Marxism is not orthodox, at least not in the narrow way that such labels are typically construed, since as historical conditions change, it becomes necessary to diverge from Marx and to betray him, to even carry out a revolution against his works in order to remain faithful to Marxism. We might think of that formula Gary shared with us this morning: translation is treason, and yet it's the only form of fidelity. In his prison notebooks, Gramsci would continue to meditate on this idea and reframe it as a matter of translation, stating that it is the task of the Marxist theoretician to, quote, "translate in theoretical language the elements of historical life. It is not reality which should be expected to conform to the abstract schema," end quote. The theoretical claims of Marxism, in other words, are historically determinate translations of concrete situations and not eternal formulas that can be applied to any and every historical context. Hence the title of this presentation, Marxism as Translation, Marxism as the method of translating historical life into theoretical language. In contrast, what is sometimes mistaken for Marxism, the conversion of Marxist theses into abstract schema and the reduction of disparate historical situations into mere exemplifications of that schema, is what Gramsci interchangeably calls Byzantinism or scholasticism, the, quote, regressive tendency to treat so-called theoretical questions as if they had a value in themselves, independently of any specific practice, end quote. As an aside, it is worth noting that Marx, during a discussion of method in the Grundrisse, also warned against this tendency, writing that, quote, even the most abstract categories are a product of historic relations and possess their full validity only for and within these relations, end quote. This understanding of Marxist theory nevertheless comes with a certain risk, namely that it might be misconstrued as confining the results of Marx's investigations to the specific historical conditions of which they are the product, as if his writings had nothing to teach other times and places and could not meaningfully contribute to the analysis of new historical conjunctures. Gramsci's position, however, is a different one, that the theoretical claims of Marx and all subsequent Marxists must endure another kind of translation if they are to speak to historical contexts other than their own. Gramsci develops this point in a brief but important note on Lenin in translation, in which he writes that Lenin, quote, in dealing with organizational questions, wrote and said more or less this: "We have not been able to translate our language into those of Europe," end quote. As Sandro Massadro and Brett Nielsen have pointed out, Gramsci is alluding to and paraphrasing, we could even say translating, Lenin's speech 5 years of the Russian Revolution and the prospects of the world revolution. During this speech, Lenin engages in a self-critique of the Communist International's resolution on the organizational structure of the communist parties because, in his words, everything in the resolution is based on Russian conditions. This leads Lenin to conclude, quote, "We have not learnt to present our Russian experience to foreigners," end quote. For Gramsci, Lenin's self-criticism identifies a problem of translation. Not in the strict sense of linguistic translation, since the Comintern had many competent translators of Russian, but in the sense of carrying theoretical claims across different historical contexts so that the lessons of the Russian experience can have an impact elsewhere and ultimately contribute to raising the prospects of world revolution. For this to occur, the lessons need to be translated into other languages, which is to say that the Comintern's resolution concerning the party form as a product of the Russian Revolution needs to be rethought and adapted to address the specific historical conditions of other countries. What Gramsci takes away from Lenin's self-critical assessment, in other words, is the importance of translation for an internationalist politics, a politics that does not dogmatically impose the Russian experience on other countries, irrespective of their divergent historical circumstances, but likewise does not construe the revolution of 1917 as an isolated incident that only impacts the future of one country. With that being said, we can now appreciate how the two kinds of translation that Gramsci describes are actually interrelated. If Marxism is the translation of historical life into theoretical language, Gramsci uses the generic term linguaggio, meaning language as such. This translation can occur in different languages or tongues, what Gramsci calls different lingue, that correspond to different concrete situations. The Comintern's resolution is one such example of translating historical life into theoretical language, but this translation occurs in a Russian tongue, which means that the resolution's claims about the party form in general are based on the specific historical conditions of Russia. If these claims are to travel outside of Russia in a non-dogmatic way, they need to be translated into other tongues, reformulated in accordance with different historical conditions. Put another way, Gramsci's reflections on Lenin in translation are a call to reimagine the vanguard party for Europe and elsewhere, to reinvent the party's organizational structure based on the specificity of other political climates. These reflections nevertheless beg the question, are all elements of Marxist theory equally translatable? And what does the answer to this question imply about the relationship between Russia and the world, a specific context and a general condition, the particular and the universal? In another passage from the prison notebooks, the final one that I will mention today, Gramsci gestures toward a response to these questions. He writes, quote, this one's rather complicated, so I'll read it slowly. "The problem arises of whether a theoretical truth, whose discovery corresponded to a specific practice, can be generalized and considered as universal for a historical epoch. The proof of its universality consists precisely, 1, in its becoming a stimulus to know better the reality of a situation that is different from that in which it was discovered, and 2, in its capacity to incorporate itself in that same reality as if it were originally an expression of it. It is in this incorporation that its concrete universality lies. In short, the principle must always rule that ideas are a continually renewed expression of real historical development. It can further be deduced that every truth, even if it is universal, owes its effectiveness to its being expressed in the languages appropriate to particular concrete situations," end quote. To unpack this rich and complicated passage, we can begin with Gramsci's claim that every theoretical truth is the product of a specific practice occurring in a specific situation. Such a truth may be articulated as universal, but it only becomes concretely universal once it has incorporated itself into a new situation as if it had always been an expression of that situation. To say this is to challenge the tradition of thinking that approaches universality as something static and invariable, which can be posited in advance, as in the case of axiomatic truths or first principles. Gramsci instead participates in the dialectical tradition that attends to the historical development of universality, its movement from the abstract to the concrete. Consider along these lines how Marx describes such a movement in the aforementioned section on method from the Grundrisse. Quote, "The concrete is concrete because it is the concentration of many determinations, hence unity of the diverse. It appears in the process of thinking, therefore, as a process of concentration, as a result, not as a point of departure," end quote. For a theoretical truth to arrive at the concrete and become the concentration of many determinations, Gramsci maintains that it must be translated, that it must be reformulated into the specific terms, the language of a reality other than the reality in which it was discovered. If it cannot be expressed in such specific terms, on the other hand, it reveals itself to be, quote, "a Byzantine and scholastic abstraction, good only for phrasemongers to toy with," end quote. This distinction clarifies what is at stake in Gramsci's reflections on the Russian Revolution and on the Marxist tradition more broadly. He is ultimately concerned with its translatability, with deciphering which of its theoretical truths can stimulate a better understanding of concrete situations in Europe, and moreover, which of these truths can become concretely universal by surviving the process of translation that would incorporate them into European historical reality as expressions of that historical reality. So I decided to begin my presentation with this overview of Gramsci's thinking about translation, I suppose for two reasons. The first that I'll mention that I didn't write down but I've been thinking about is there's a way in which isn't true of this conference, which is great, there's a way in which two really fundamental thinkers of translation theory, Benjamin and Derrida, tend to sort of dominate the conversation of what translation can be and who theorizes about translation, even to the extent that everyone else who theorizes about translation have to be turned into versions of Benjamin and Derrida. And my sense is that starting presentations thinking about other theorists, so I've mentioned Gramsci, who sometimes comes up in discussions, but who I'll mention after never come up in these discussions, is meant to try to open up other types of conversations about translation theory and show that it's much more capacious than sort of the lineage of two thinkers, who admittedly, of course, are very important thinkers of translation. So that's one reason why I wanted to start with Gramsci. But I started with Gramsci also because his thinking about translation touches on a number of core ideas that guide and frame my own work on Marxism in Latin America. In my view, at the center of any such inquiry should be a focus on the task of translating universality, which is to say, on the effort to transform Marxism's universalist claims and make them concrete in response to new and unforeseen conjunctures. With this focus, my approach to the topic of Marxism in Latin America diverges from two opposing tendencies. The first tendency assumes that Marxism's scope is universal from the start, and that it therefore does not require translations, sort of the anti-translation tendency, or what I've called a dogmatic tendency. This tendency has historically materialized itself in Latin America via the uncritical reception and dogmatic application of Marxist theory throughout the region, from Victorio Codavilla's blanket Stalinism in the 30s and 40s. So Stalinism explains the entire region of Latin America for this figure, and actually for decades that would be something a number of so-called Marxists would uphold. All the way to the pseudo-Maoism of the Shining Path in the 80s and early 90s, another terrible moment in the history of so-called Marxism in Latin America. Such an outlook toward Marxist theory, as I've already suggested, misconstrues the natures of its universals as timeless axioms, rather than continually renewed expressions of historical development that change and take shape over time. The second tendency from which my work diverges can be read as a critical response to the first tendency that nevertheless reproduces its limitations. This tendency aims to provincialize Marxism, to reveal how its universalist language erases cultural difference by generalizing that which only holds true for certain European countries. From this perspective, Marxism is ultimately an inadequate theory for comprehending the irreducible heterogeneity of non-European realities. This may sound familiar depending on what sort of conferences you've attended before this one, but versions of this argument can be found throughout the history of Latin America as well, from Jose Marti's rejection of Marx based on the exceptionality of Latin America, to the identitarian indigenist anti-Marxism of the late Fausto Reynaga, someone who was once a Marxist and later rejected Marxism, to the work of many of today's decolonialists, and the first name would be Walter Mignolo, but there are others. There is a kernel of truth to this tendency insofar as it rightly insists that an unmodified theoretical claim derived from a European context, no matter if it is articulated as universal, will generally be misplaced in Latin America and out of touch with its historical specificity. And yet the danger of this line of argument is that it tends to foreclose in advance the possibility of Marxism's translation, of its reinvention on the basis of Latin America's own historical contradictions. The provincialization tendency therefore begins to resemble the prior dogmatic tendency insofar as it subscribes to the same conception of universality, a conception devoid of temporality and becoming. It is in fact a negative mirror image of the dogmatic tendency, for it denies as false the timeless universals that the dogmatic tendency celebrates as invariably true. I want to propose an altogether different approach by arguing that Marxism begins rather than ends with recognizing the provinciality of its universalist claims. Or more precisely, in the language I've been using, with acknowledging the historically determining character of its theses and the abstract form of their universality. Yet this is only the beginning, for Marxism in its truest form is constantly moving toward deprovincializing itself through the formation of concrete universals. This kind of thinking also has a history in Latin America, with José Carlos Mariátegui as one of its earliest proponents. For those of you who may not be familiar with Mariátegui's work, he studied in the same milieu as Gramsci before returning to his native Peru, and independently developed his own theory of Marxism as a method of theoretical translation. I have a long article about this in Spanish, if people are interested. But so as to appreciate their similarities, we need only recall, in light of what has already been discussed, one of Mariátegui's most famous statements. He once wrote, "We certainly do not want socialism in Latin America to be a copy or imitation. We have to give life to Indo-American socialism with our own reality in our own language." And so there he's using the same language ultimately as Gramsci, and that's because both of them share a number of interlocutors so that they can arrive to those types of claims. So although I began this presentation by acknowledging that Marxism is often reduced to a name for that which is irredeemably outdated, it should be noted that this is the case in very particular settings, such as within the confines of certain Byzantine debates in the North American Academy. In other locations, from the Lacandon jungle to the Andean Sierra and beyond, Marxism remains a guiding light for some of today's most significant and inspiring political experiments. The task of translating universality is still an urgent one for these experiments, but has acquired a further dimension of complexity. So in a sense, I'm moving towards part two of the paper right now. While grappling with the particularity of Latin American historical reality, Marxist theorists have become increasingly aware that they can no longer ignore indigenous forms of thought and politics that contain their own, sometimes competing articulations of universality. For the remainder of my time, I would like to telegraphically discuss one example of this kind of translation between competing universalities, namely Subcomandante Marcos's conceptualization of Zapatismo as translating between Marxism and indigenous Maya cosmology. So I should say, maybe as some background, the history of Marxism in Latin America, in its best form, does try to think seriously about the particularity of Latin America and not simply assimilate or apply whatever is coming from either Europe or the Soviet Union. But it oftentimes treats Latin America as only the realm of the particular, and not as itself articulating systems that are universalist in form, and at its own peril, because this often disallows Marxism to have serious conversations throughout the 20th century with indigenous movements and indigenous thinkers. And so through a lot of not so great experiments, recently Marxism in Latin America has been moving towards a much different relationship with indigenous-led movements. At least that's my claim, and I'll take you through how I see that. So first, let me say that by competing universalities, I have in mind Judith Butler's theorization of this notion during her polemical exchange with Ernesto Laclau and Slavoj Žižek in the volume Contingency, Hegemony, Universality, Contemporary Dialogues on the Left. Here's the relevant passage. Quote, "If the particular is actually studied in its particularity, it may be that a certain competing version of universality is intrinsic to the particular movement itself. It may be that feminism, for instance, maintains a view of universality that implies forms of sexual egalitarianism. Or it may be that struggles for racial equality have within them a conception of universal enfranchisement. The question for such movements will be one of establishing practices of translation among competing notions of universality, which, despite any apparent logical incompatibility, may nevertheless belong to an overlapping set of social and political aims," end quote. So what Butler is inviting us to consider is the possibility of forming an alliance between feminism and the struggle for racial equality that would require as its precondition an engagement in a kind of translation practice, one that would constellate different universalist formations intrinsic to these particular movements so as to construct a space of compossibility between them. What I want to propose is that something similar is happening now in Latin America between Marxism and some of its most widespread indigenous-led movements. Let's consider in this light Subcomandante Marcos's discussion of the Zapatista movement in a book-length interview titled El Sueño Zapatista, or The Zapatista Dream. I'll begin with his response to the charge that the Zapatistas regularly use concepts that stray from traditional Marxism. Quote, "Yes, what I'm saying," he's got quite a direct way of speaking to the translator. "Yes, what I'm saying is that began a long time ago in the process of translation from Marxist-Leninist university culture to indigenous culture. That translation was actually a transformation. I remember reading that whoever translates poetry is in reality a poet. In this case, the true creators of Zapatismo were the translators. They constructed a new way of seeing the world," end quote. Marcos is referring to the eventual outcome of the first encounters between his armed guerrilla organization and the Maya indigenous communities of Chiapas in the late 80s and early 90s. According to Marcos, the guerrilla organization believed that it would assume the leadership role of the revolutionary vanguard, the classic one we all know, and in his words, open the eyes of the blind Indians. Yet that is precisely what did not happen. Instead, the militant group, quote, "still within the Marxist-Leninist tradition, suddenly found itself before a reality that it could not explain, a reality for which it could not give an account, but with which it had to struggle," end quote. The guerrillas gradually realized, in other words, that they were the ones who were blind, that their traditional, untranslated Marxism was out of place and out of touch with the contradictions of the Lacandon jungle. It was just after this realization that Marcos met a Maya community member that he refers to fondly as the translator, El Viejo Antonio, the old guy Antonio. According to Marcos, it was through Antonio that he and the other guerrillas, quote, "began to learn about their history of political formation, of their historical consciousness, and it became clear that we were not speaking with an indigenous movement that was waiting for a savior, but rather with an indigenous movement with a long tradition of struggle, a resistant and also intelligent indigenous movement for which we function simply as its armed branch." The sort of inversion there of the thinking head and the mass body. The guerrillas, the supposed leaders, are actually just the armed of the struggle, the violent arm of the struggle. Antonio's fundamental contribution was making intelligible to the Zapatistas the specificity of the indigenous question in the mountains of southeastern Mexico, end quote. Marcos thus narrates a process of re-education facilitated by Antonio's lessons on indigenous Maya thought and politics. In response to Antonio's the guerrillas do not completely abandon Marxism, but begin to translate their own beliefs in light of the new understanding of their environment. In this way, Marcos describes a situation that shares a number of structural similarities with Gramsci's thinking about translation. Later in the interview, however, Marcos offers another account of his earliest interactions with Antonio, which greatly complicates their significance for the formation of the Zapatista movement. So before, in other words, there was this sort of typical dialectic between specificity, generality, particularity, universality, but something changes. The dream of a guerrilla, Marcos recalls, was to encounter a peasant, explain politics to him, and win him over. So I began to speak to Antonio about the history of Mexico, about Zapatismo, and he responds to me with the history of the Maya gods Botan and Ikal. End quote. In this brief but significant remembrance of the past, Marcos gestures towards something more complex than the encounter between universalist ideas and the particularity of a new historical reality. In this case, there is also an encounter between two fundamentally different belief systems or worldviews. To Marcos's Marxist-Leninist explanation of society, Antonio responds with his own explanation of Maya cosmology. What I want to suggest here is that this meeting of alternative worldviews points toward a splintering at the level of the universal itself. For both worldviews are precisely that, views of the world that contain certain notions and concepts that are articulated as universal in scope. When Antonio explains Maya cosmology to Marcos, he is effectively translating a distinct mode of universality, a mode that is irreducible to the guerrilla organization's Marxist universalism. The question that this encounter raises, which is also Butler's question, is to what extent some form of translation is possible between these competing universalities. Marcos hints at one possible answer to this question through his discussion of Antonio and other Maya translators that make up what are referred to as the intermediate group. This group believed in the armed struggle and discussed the Marxist ideas of the Zapatista army with the indigenous communities, but also instructed the guerrillas on the history and present concerns of the Maya Indians. The intermediate group thus functioned as a kind of bridge that allowed translation to go in both directions between the guerrillas and the indigenous communities. It is precisely to this group of indigenous translators that Marcos attributes the creation of Zapatismo, momentarily displacing the term's historical allusion to Emilio Zapata and the Mexican Revolution to name a space of encounter and reciprocal exchange between Maya cosmology and Marxist theory. So that's what Zapatismo names in this moment for Marcos. From this space of encounter, the translators create what Marcos describes as a new way of seeing the world. Although it would be tempting to understand this new vision of the world as replacing the old worldviews of the Marxist and the Maya, as creating, in other words, a new universalism to supplant prior universalisms, Marcos is actually gesturing at something more obscure but also more groundbreaking. In the fourth declaration of the Lacandon Django, which was released around the same time as when the interview with Marcos took place, it states, "In the world we want, many worlds fit. El mundo que queremos es uno donde quepan muchos mundos." You may have heard this in the streets before because it's become quite a famous slogan. With this powerful image that defies formal logic, the Zapatistas theorized the space of encounter as a space in which universality becomes one and multiple at the same time, in which multiple worlds become a world without the erasure of differences. This is the new way of seeing the world created by the Zapatista translators, this paradoxical worldview in which many worldviews can fit. But not all worldviews, and maybe we can talk about what that's about in questions. Although much more could be said about the Zapatista movement, I've discussed it briefly here so as to underscore the actuality rather than the obsolescence of the problem of Marxism's translation, which increasingly entails the interrelated issue of Marxism's negotiation with, rather than co-optation or erasure of, competing universalist modes of thought and politics. Thanks so much.
Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce Fadi Badruil. It's going to be really interesting to see how these two papers speak to each other. I think it's going to make for a great discussion. So Fadi Badruil is Assistant Professor of Contemporary Arab Cultures in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's an anthropologist by training. His research examines traditions of intellectual inquiry, practices of public criticism, and modalities of political engagement of contemporary Arab intellectuals, both at home and in the diaspora. In doing so, he takes the international circulation of critical theory as an anthropological object by tracking its translations, its analytical uses, and its political appropriations. He has a forthcoming book, which is going forth under the title Emancipation Binds, Arab Revolutionary Marxism, Disenchantment Critique, which will be coming from Duke University Press in the very, very first month of 2020. We're waiting for it anxiously. This is a book that examines the ebbing away of Marxist thought and practice through focusing on the intellectual and political trajectories of a generation of previously militant public intellectuals. You can also find his writings in or forthcoming in a number of places. One of them is Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, which is the piece on Talal Asad, I think. Was that right? Yeah. Also the Journal of Palestine Studies, Boundary 2, Jadaliyah, and a couple of others in Al Akbar Daily, I'll just mention, which I guess was that like there was a ongoing column, was that?
Yeah, that stopped in 2011 after the Syrian Revolution because of their politics.
As did many things. And his talk today is going forward under a slightly different title. So the title, as I understand it, is Theories, Resistances, Translating the 1960s Arab New Left and the 2011 Revolutions. So please join me in welcoming Fadi Barouil.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. I mean, the Graduate Center is really a second home. I've spent a long time here since 2002, and especially the committee. So thank you, Gary. Thank you, Lindsay, so much. As Tony said, this is a talk in two parts. The first part is really me trying to think through the resistances I encountered when I started to look at the Arab Marxist tradition as an anthropologist. And the second part shoots forward towards the present to think about how multiple theorists and leftist intellectuals used theory to foreclose the emancipatory dimension of the Arab revolutions. And I end with a small coda on revisiting the tradition of anti-colonial thought and its thoughts on translation. So a small prologue, which may sound a bit geopolitical for you, I hope not. Looked at from the perspective of the Arab revolutions, we seem to be entering a post-colonial time in the Arab world that is beginning the process of a political decentering of the West in practice after it has been subjected to multiple iterations of theoretical decenterings in the past. This is not only because the practice of the 2011 revolutionaries, who, unlike older generations, were not propelled mainly by anti-imperialist engines. So you can think about the independence movement, or the Marxist movements, or the Islamist movements, and how at the heart of their basically theory and practice was a notion of anti-imperialism, whether it's political, cultural, or economic. But also because of the recent geopolitical conjuncture, which dislodged the post-Cold War arrangement during which the West, and particularly the US, was the supreme intervening military power. Arab, regional, think Turkey and Iran, and non-Western international powers, such as Russia, mainly in Syria, are increasingly involved in the region. Two caveats. First, unlike its decentering in theory, which is staged as a liberatory act of decolonization, its decentering in practice did not usher in a progressive era. A quick glance at the Russian, Iranian, Turkish, and Israeli involvements in Syria, in addition to Western ones, and the destruction they brought on, are enough to put an end to the automatic association of the decentering of the West with the horizon of justice. Having said that, this is certainly not a cause for imperial nostalgia and to begin lamenting the decline of Western civilization. The legacies of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the never-ending war on terror are still unfolding, not to mention the continuing US support of the Israeli colonization of Palestinian lands. Moreover, the multipolar interventions today are in part the consequences of the recent US interventions in the area. This decentering is a crucial fact, I think, to be reckoned with, without celebration or lamentation, and it is not an easy thing to do at all, since clear-cut binary antagonisms and the logic of the main contradiction are hard to dislodge from political alignments and some critical contraptions. So in excavating the forgotten archive of the 1960s Lebanese New Left, as well as in observing the multiple discourses representing the 211 revolutions, I have often had to deal with and try to overcome a set of theoretical, disciplinary, and political resistances. In the first case, they were for the most part resistances towards a charitable translation of the Arab Marxist tradition. I mean, to recall what Bashir Diagne was saying yesterday, it always seemed to me that Arab Marxists were not given hospitality. And the question that I've always struggled with is basically who is translated, who is condemned, for whom do we extend acts of hospitality in theory. And the second part, the one that has to do with the Arab revolutions, the resistance was towards the translation of the practices of these men and women who have risen against their regimes into the domain of emancipatory politics, if not the wholesale foreclosure of their practice from the domain of the political, by either focusing on state languages such as terrorism, or humanitarian languages such as refugees, or irrational languages such as sectarian vengeance, etc. So if you can think, you think about the figure of the terrorist, the refugee, and the sectarian. These theoretical resistances to translation uncover a metropolitan unconscious at work, which keeps the West at its heart, either to load it or to criticize it. Critical strategies that rely exclusively on speaking back to the West through marshalling a set of binaries, homogenization, difference, universal, particular, secular, non-secular, westernized elite, non-westernized masses, liberal Muslims, non-liberal Muslims, etc., retain it at the heart of their deepest attachment. These strategies cannot account for political practice outside of its relation and opposition to imperial orbits, obliterating the revolutionaries' attempts to make their own history and reinscribing once again the West as the main subject and agent of history. So my claim in what follows is a very simple one. In this new conjuncture, the labors of translations are needed more than ever to basically invent new figures of the thinkable. And I think the first step in this process is to think through the resistances to translation, which is a question of epistemological reflexivity and a politically urgent one, since translation is at the heart of rethinking a politics of solidarity. I mean, a question that I don't have an answer to, but which has basically been on my mind for a while, and me and Gary have chatted about it, is how to be in solidarity across difference in an unequal world without either domesticating difference or paternalism. So, part two, the Arabization of Marxism. The militants I've worked with and whose archives I've excavated mainly were part of Socialist Lebanon, an independent Marxist group that was founded in the mid-60s. These men and women inaugurated really a sophisticated minoritarian tradition of revolutionary and critical Arab theory, characterized by what the French thinker Christine Bucquet-Glucksmann called transversalité des savoirs, a transversality of knowledges, which I think is much more interesting than thinking through interdisciplinarity in terms of academic languages, which defied the logics of professionalization, expertise, and disciplinarity. So they weaved their works by engaging authors such as Marx, Lenin, Luxembourg, Mao, Gramsci, Althusser, Ibn Khaldun, Diab, Bourdieu, Castoriadis, and Abdurrahman al-Jabarti, amongst others. So in excavating this archive, it provided me with multiple eccentric vantage points located outside of our centers, academic centers, their institutions, disciplines, and languages, which of course bypassed the kind of colonial divide assigning the Global South as the locus of concrete facts and the North as the manufacturer of abstract theory. In doing so, I think there was a big gain in reflexivity, one which is generated by highlighting how the questions, stakes, modes of criticism, and practices of engagement of Arab Marxist intellectuals speak back to the ones practiced in critical anthropology, area studies, and post-colonial studies, what I called earlier the critical disciplines metropolitan unconscious. In fact, it is this unconscious which is in part responsible for the neglect of the archive of Arab Marxism. Except for the brief third worldist interlude of the 60s, when militant intellectuals like Mao, Diab, and Guevara were read and commented on, Western Marxists did not, for the most part, seek out, translate, and converse with the tradition's non-Western theorists. Moreover, Arab Marxists were either criticized or neglected by critics whose reading practices condemned them for what they dubbed as their Orientalist, historicist, and modernist discursive assumptions. Their epistemological complicity with empire, quote unquote, turned them overnight from revolutionaries to discursive compradors. So you know you're really out of luck when both Eurocentric Marxists and their post-colonial critics both agree to ignore you or criticizes you. It's true. Moreover, the imbrication of scholarship on the Middle East and Western political agendas sidelined militants who were neither bound by the frontiers of the nation-state, think Arab nationalist movements, nor the boundaries of religious traditions, think political Islamist revivalist movements. Last but not least, and I think these militant intellectuals who shared many of the same texts that came to constitute later on, because they read Gramsci way earlier than basically when Gramsci made its appearance in US anthropology, at least a couple of decades before us. So came to constitute later on the body of theory that we draw on appeared at first sight to be much closer to our discipline's theoretical skin than, say, Salafi Muslims. Their low coefficient of otherness pushes to the limit the question of who occupies the slot of anthropological translation and is a subject of charitable interpretation and who is the object of epistemological condemnation. This is why, in recovering this history, I worked against the tendency to treat modern and contemporary intellectuals as falling into one of two camps, which reproduce this sort of metropolitan unconscious. Either imitators of the West, call them self-orientalizing and westernized natives if you want, or autochthonous intellectuals, call them religious thinkers. So that's the cultural divide. But I also hope to sort of engage also away from an intellectual history that sort of treats Arab Marxists through a history of unilateral reception of Western theory, which at times announces itself with sensationalist titles such as Reading Althusser in Beirut or something of that sort, anticipating the dazzlement at the wonderful conjunction of reading a universal text in a particular location. So reception presumes an a priori an origin and a destination, an authentic and a copy, while I'm making a case for the primacy of multi-directional streams of translation. And I make this case based on the work of Socialist Lebanon. So let me talk for a bit now about their own practices and thoughts on translation. It's really difficult to conceive the lives of these translations of leftist militant intellectuals without dwelling on the intimate relation to the practice of translation they had. In fact, one of my claims is that it's through the practice of translation that you have the constitution of basically a revolutionary habitus that then becomes a sort of public intellectual habitus. It's through that, a life of sort of like shuttling between mostly three languages, English, French, and Arabic. So during the days of militancy, one translated for purposes of political education as a strategy to give Marxist political arguments a different gloss on a doctrinal point and to anchor a political line in a theoretical ground. Without revolutionary theory, there is no social movement, a revolutionary movement. Later on, one did it to make a text available for students in a seminar, and of course, it's always one way to earn some income. These translations, especially those associated with the Marxist tradition, were not translated from their original languages, but mostly from French and English translations. At times, an Arabic text was produced by simultaneously translating from English and French translations. So Gramsci's Modern Prince was produced through, an Arabic version of it was produced through simultaneously working with the English and the French translation by a Francophone and an Anglophone sort of comrades. In the particular case of a translation from a translation, the Metropole's languages and publishing houses, particularly Les Éditions Maspero in French, Les Temps Modernes, and New Left Review, were pivotal institutional bridges that made via their languages the ideas and experiences of different militants and theorists from North and South accessible to each other. I say one, of course, because this globally interconnected world, which was fashioned by the practice and travels of militants, as well as the intense circulation of text, did not always transit through there. It was also fostered by the art festivals, publications, and intellectual, political, and military institutions of the non-aligned and socialist worlds. Besides their labors of linguistic translations, these militants effected an additional act of translation. The knowledges they produced relying on the transnational discourses of radical thought, were not merely representations but interventions in their societies. They underscored the centrality of adapting Marxist concepts for the formulation of a communist politics attentive to the characteristics of their political present. These were more like acts of transfiguration, and I borrow this from Elizabeth Povenelli and Goankar. Transfiguration that refunctions a text for a different demanding site, moving away from the translator's problematic of meaning and its attendant questions. So these acts of linguistic translations from translations and conceptual transfigurations were fueled much more by the impediment of revolutionary practice than a fidelity to an original text. And to think about this question of fidelity is really to think about the temporality of translation. And at a very, very practical level, i.e. how much time do you have to basically produce a text and put it in circulation if you think you're engaging in a revolutionary struggle? Like, how much time can you sit on it, right? So the question of fidelity, the question of really accessing the original, the question of spending 10 years to read German in order to sort of like read the original text in German was not really something that was a part of the horizon of practice, literally. So they were not mediations between a self and another, an attempt to bridge supposed incommensurabilities between cultures, or an initiation of a dialogue between different traditions. Theirs was not an attempt that sought, as many critical and anthropological works do, to render what seems unfamiliar at first glance, or going in the opposite direction, what seems unfamiliar at first glance familiar, or going in the opposite direction to denaturalize what we take for granted. The practice that pulls together all the isolated issues and highlights the condition of their political realization, affirms Socialist Lebanon, that's a quote from them, is theoretical practice, end of quote. If the analysis of the present is foregone, the party will be transformed into, and here I'm citing again, splintered sectors, each working on its own without any relation to the others, but attending central committee meetings and discussing the general line that does not generalize anything but a bunch of slogans that should work in Bolivia, Sudan, and Lebanon, which means that they are not valid in any country. End of quote. The emphasis on the present forecloses for Socialist Lebanon the possibility of a general and repeatable answer, which cuts across times and spaces. In doing so, they argued against viewing Marxism as a direct translation of a body of theory to disparate particular situations that are themselves not generative of theoretical elaborations, but passive recipients of a revealed universal discourse. Failure to translate for them is to transform Marx's oeuvre to a dead letter, a lettre morte. There's no way then of being a proper communist without engaging in a translation of Marx's work, but that one that does not constitute an inauthentic copy of the original, a distortion of the universal text, or a failed mimicry of the West. On the contrary, translations are generative and constitutive, not only of Lebanese Marxism, but of the communist tradition of thought and practice. Innovative socialist revolutions, Socialist Lebanon write, have been tied to novel theoretical thought. The Bolsheviks and Lenin, the Chinese and Mao, the Vietnamese and Giap, the Cubans and Guevara, end of quote. In their interpretation, Marx's oeuvre constitutes the foundational text of the tradition, which authorizes socialist political practice and thought. It does not, however, stand as the untroubled trans-historical universal to the particular glosses that come in its wake. Rather, Marxism cannot be separated from the circulation and translations across time and space of Marxist works, including the numerous returns to Marx's oeuvre itself. The universality of Marxism is constituted through and is a product of, in this case, the multiple acts of translations and does not precede them. These practices, discourses, and institutions assumed and produced a global interconnectedness, a political universality of sorts, premised on international solidarity, and this is really what I'm interested in. So the urgency of political practice and the multidirectional streams of translation, north-south, south-south, which dodged the usual trap of recognition and consecration of authors from the colonies by the strong institutions of the metropole. The structures of power the colonized writer confronts, Tal Asad wrote a long time ago, are institutional, not textual. When someone pleads with the colonizer to make a judgment in a particular writer's favor to have him or her translated and read seriously, what is taught, he added, is the modern world's culture's transcendent power to redefine the writer's value as universal, end quote. In the case Asad is describing, The Metropol's institutions are the gatekeepers that grant access to an author, to the universal, enabling the global circulation and multiple translations of the work in its wake, even though it's a universal which always falls short of attaining true universality. Literary criticism in the Anglo-American Academy, Rosalind Morris notes, and here I'm citing her, tends to attribute to the third world literary text an irreducible particularity. The resistance here, she writes, is not of the third world writer and or her writings, let alone by the subaltern. It is the resistance of dominance to its possible displacement from the exclusive claim to universality. End of quote. I mean, in highlighting these points, what I'm really after is sort of thinking about different pathways to think about universality. One is the a posteriori outcome of political articulation, which I sort of drew on socialist Lebanon to make a case which is sustained by an ethos of international solidarity that through traveling theories and militants and multiple acts of translations and transfigurations fashions a common world. True, historically, this pathway was premised on positing class as the universal grammar of inequality, as Sudipta Kaviraj has called it, but its universality was socially mediated and needed to be activated through the practices of translation and militancy. The second pathway privileges contextless, supposedly a priori universal concepts, say rights, reason, freedom, which subsume and are in no need of the double movement of transfiguration and militancy. And the third is the one that I referred to by mentioning Assad's work, which is the metropolitan institutional consecration, which is an outcome of power. Okay, part two. So our world is very different from that leftist world of the 60s. That sort of conceived the word revolution, as Traverso put it in his last book, as a process unfolding in three distinct but dialectically correlated geographical spheres: anti-capitalist in the first world, anti-bureaucratic in the world of really existing socialism, and anti-imperialist in the third world. Today, the borders between certain quarters of the left and the right are getting harder and harder to discern. The Arab revolutions put on the table again the thorny political and theoretical question of how to name an event. The practices of emancipation, particularly the Syrian ones, have been hastily brushed off in certain Arab and metropolitan leftist circles as not properly revolutionary. I focus on the Syrian revolution because unlike the initial celebrations after toppling the pro-Western Tunisian and Egyptian presidents, the uprisings in Syria were met from the get-go by suspicious apprehension or support of the regime by certain quarters of the left. The practices of the revolutionaries who early on faced a ruthless war machine, which was not a client of Western powers, clashed with ideological first principles, primarily anti-imperialism, but also secularism, that guide these leftist political alignment. Solidarity with them was withdrawn and first principles prevailed over practice. Moreover, this dismissal seems to have been vindicated by the tragic unfolding of events. The political defeats of the revolutions appear to confirm the truth of the judgment, and that is part of a distinguished genealogy of the collapse of conceptual truth onto political victory on the left. Little has eviscerated Marxism, Russell Jacoby wrote a long time ago in Dialectic of Defeat, more than its acceptance of the judgment of history as truth itself. Victory, he reminds us, is not proof of truth, and vice versa. Moving beyond an assessment of the first principles that guide the left's political alignments, can our critical theories apprehend the event? In what way is the theoretical apprehension of the event, its naming, overdetermined by belatedness, i.e. coming after revolutions from which the conceptual features of what defines a revolution is distilled? Seasoned scholars of Arab political life who tried their hands at giving a critical account of the revolution outside of Eurocentric and statist molds drew their analytical tools from a leftist theoretical toolkit which is critical of neoliberalism. Asif Bayat compared the Arab revolutions to the third worldist revolutions of the 60s and the 70s and concluded that today's militants were co-opted by neoliberal logic and therefore lacked the radical anti-imperialist and social justice visions of emancipation that animated earlier revolutionary movements. The revolutionaries themselves were not proper By the time the Arab uprisings occurred, he writes, most Islamists and secular counterparts alike had been conditioned by the neoliberal climate. End of quote. I have a few qualms with this account. First, it bears a family resemblance with the deficit pronouncements that account for the present predicament of Arab societies by underscoring its deficits in democracy, human rights, women's rights, you name it, that separate them from a Western liberal democratic norm. In this case, the interpretation of the revolutions is overdetermined by their belatedness vis-à-vis the Third Worldist revolutionary moment. This comparative exercise overlooks the historical unfolding of the past century's revolutions that witnessed the transformations of anti-imperialist politics, whether secular or Islamist, and socialist ideologies, from visions of emancipation to bludgeons of power in the hands of regimes and militant forces. Think Syria, Iraq, Libya, etc. To point this out is not an argument for foregoing past and present anti-imperialist and socialist traditions in the Arab world. Rather, it is a reminder that the political conjunctures in which the revolutions unfolded is not one that can be subsumed under a smooth global narrative of transition from the good old past of radical internationalist socialisms onto the bad neoliberal present. These pasts are connected in more than one way to our present. Moreover, Bayat's account is articulated in a behaviorist idiom which makes neoliberalism an overbearing climate which conditions militants of various ideological shades. What really troubles me the most is the attempt to critically apprehend the multiple interconnections of our present at the levels of the circulation of capital and the productivity of political rationalities in a totalizing behaviorist theoretical dialect, which is marshaled to banish the militants from the domain of revolutionary politics. The will to totality this account performs is hard to square with the multiple political discourses, forms, and collective initiatives in the Arab world. There is a particular ease with which the totalizing critical scholar delimits from his Olympian perch the parameters of the political game, structured in advance by the transcendental force. In this case, it's not the West, it's neoliberalism. So back to the West. The revolutions also breached the matrix of left politics and critical theory that could not overcome the empire-resistance binary. To say this is to point that critical theories do not only fall short of apprehending events by active conceptual erasures and totalizing sweeps. At times, critical theory falls short because the event falls out of its circumscribed terrains of operation and remains invisible as a result. The metropolitan oppositional epistemology critique, which caught like wildfire in the wake of Said's Orientalism in '78, did not develop a critical conceptual tool to grasp the modalities of power at work in Arab and Muslim societies whose subject was not the West. Its anti-interventionism performs well as long as its targets and discourse, its targets are discourses with universal aspirations, human rights, or cultural reifications about Islam and the Arab mind. Major crises in the region that did not revolve in the orbit of the West politically and culturally, such as the massacres and battles during the Lebanese civil wars, 1975-1990, the Syrian regime's massacre in Hama, 1988, the Iran-Iraq war of the 80s, remained invisible in theory. The issue, of course, is not exclusive to anti-imperialist practices of epistemology critique. The critical bite of more than a few of our critical theories is circumscribed by the implicit delimitation of their terrain. Deconstructionism, for instance, was mostly dominant, Rose Morris says again, in those spaces of the literary critical establishment where the textual objects of reading could be recognized as cultural artifacts of the same system, philosophical system, to which it turned its critical eye. The Frankfurt School, of course, produced incisive and sweeping analysis of late capitalism, yet it could never surrender the West as its civilizational unit of analysis. Herbert Marcuse's allusions to anti-colonial struggles notwithstanding. A quick last few minutes on a coda on the political necessity of translation. So the foreclosure of practices of emancipation in theory and the refusal to be in political solidarity with revolutionaries bring out questions that earlier revolutionaries struggled with. As I try to make sense of our present moment, I have been finding it increasingly helpful to revisit the works of thinkers like Césaire, Fanon, Arendt, and Said, who resisted the great seduction of theory's powers of conceptual subsumption, by remaining close to the pulse of those who are struggling against domination and exploitation, and inventing new forms through translations, displacements, and the stretching of traditions in situations where the supposed mediation between theory and practice is severed. So let me end by a couple of examples. One of them actually was mentioned by Bashir yesterday, which is the very famous letter of resignation that Aimé Césaire wrote to Maurice Thorez in 1956. So, which is interesting in its timing, because it's a few years after the beginning of the Algerian Revolution, but before the height of Third World solidarity in which Socialist Lebanon was founded. Aimé Césaire, who was a député for Martinique at the time, wrote a powerful letter of resignation from the French Communist Party. Césaire, who is tackling the question of the relationship of the colonial question to communist internationalism, begins by underlining the former singularity, which cannot be reduced to any other problem. The singularity is what preempts considering the colonial struggle a fragment of a more important whole, which is constituted by the struggle of the French worker against capitalism. He draws our attention to how taking class struggle as a universal ground of critique and solidarity robbed the colonial question of its singularity, rendered it subordinate, and contributed to rejecting, and here I'm quoting, a priori, and in the name of an exclusive ideology, men who are nevertheless honest and fundamentally anti-colonialist, end of quote. He goes on to point out that despite their radical class politics, metropolitan communists, like their bourgeois compatriots, espouse a simplistic omnilateral superiority of the West, and these are his terms. Both communists and colonialists share an attitude of paternalism, one which revolutionaries have recently complained of in their dealings with practices of European solidarity with their cause, particularly Syrian revolutionaries. Césaire ends his resignation letter by urging his readers to have the strength to invent instead of follow, and to clear the path of ready-made forms, those petrified forms that obstructed. End of quote. As I read him, Césaire is clearly not arguing for foregoing alliances and solidarity. Rather, he is proposing that critical practice should be attuned to the world by inventing new forms which enable solidarities. If Césaire helps us to think the question of erasure, Fanon, writing some 5 years after him in 1961, urges us to consider how the travels of revolutionary theory can flip its valence dialectically and recode its meaning. In The Wretched of the Earth, he tackles the question of mediation between theory and practice. For Fanon, nationalist parties and their base of urban voters benefit from the colonial system, and a large number of colonial subjects adhere to metropolitan political parties. These colonial subjects, he writes, are militant activists under the abstract slogan, power to the proletariat, forgetting that in their part of the world, slogans of national liberation should come first. The colonized intellectual has invested his aggression in his barely veiled wish to be assimilated to the colonizer's word. End of quote. Fanon's critical observation alerts us to the ramifications of revolutionary theory, which is assumed to retain its critical bite, regardless of where, when, and by whom it's deployed. Marxist analysis, Fanon suggests, should always be stretched, slightly stretched when it comes to addressing the colonial issue. In opposing to the colonized militants dabbling in abstract slogans of power to the proletariat, Fanon elevates the wretched of the earth who are not assimilated to the colonial world and whose bodies bear its brunt to the role of the primary revolutionary agent. The wretched of the earth, as Dipesh Chakrabarti reminded us, were like Mao's peasants and Gramsci's subaltern, part of the search for a revolutionary subject that was not the proletariat, in the absence of a large working class, which was in itself an exercise in a series of displacements of the original terms. So inventing new forms, stretching traditions, conceptual displacements could be all part of the toolkit of rewiring critical theory in response to emancipatory emergences that trouble its already existing articulations of theory and practice, and its resistances to the eruption of events. Let me end with one sentence that I really like a lot by Césaire, and it's from his letter. What I want, Césaire wrote, is that Marxism and communism be placed in the service of black peoples, and not black peoples in the service of Marxism and communism. That the doctrine and the movement would be made to fit men, not men to fit the doctrine or the movement. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time. Yes? Okay, so we have about 16 minutes, I think, if my math's right. Maybe we'll take like maybe 2-3 questions and then we'll sort of go around. Yeah, so right here. Oh, I could come with here. This one.
Thanks, Tony. So, thank you for the talks. This is very exciting and extremely interesting, especially because I think that what I took at the core, especially on Latin America, was a rejection of the surrender of Marxism to Europe, in a sense, a rejection of that surrender that is common today in certain strands of Latin American thought, and I think that it extends not only to Marxism. I think that your argument can be extended to political philosophy in general with those arguments. But I wanted to, as it were, insofar as I agree with the general argument, to question if there is not a step further, in the sense that, so if Marxism is not a provincial language, theoretical language of Europe, and it can, through translation, be effective in Latin America, and these languages of Latin America, as the cosmology of the Maya that you mentioned, also can be translated in such a way to produce these strategies. I think that there is perhaps a need to question the presumption of appropriateness, of specificity of languages to different contexts, so that neither Marxism is a provincial European language, but also this cosmology is not the appropriate language of the Latin American Chiapas in whatever, or whichever other languages, theoretical languages. So and in a sense, I think that the practical experience of facing this situation for which the language is inappropriate, which is what Subcomandante Marcos is describing, the language of Marxist-Leninism is inappropriate, is not, as I think to a certain extent come through in Gramsci, it's not an obstacle as much as it appears at first, that you are faced with a situation for which your language is not appropriate. Because that is precisely the moment of productivity, of theoretical productivity and of political strategic productivity, that you can then say, okay, this is a transformed situation, the language is inappropriate, but nevertheless, we act, nevertheless, we are doing things. And that produces a breakthrough, which I think it is a breakthrough in Marxist political strategy, which I agree, that shift, that transformation between vanguard and mass, etc., that is a discovery, and very important discovery. But yes, I think that this is a key development.
Just wanted to get a sense of how many. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. This is for Fadi. Agreeing with almost everything you said, you didn't mention Césaire and you mentioned Fanon. I was going to ask about Samir Amin. But two other questions quickly. How would you characterize the Algerian Revolution, especially before the fall of Ben Bella, before the overthrow of Ben Bella? And how would you even characterize what's happening right now with this so-called popular, but yes, it is popular mass thing about Bouteflika's resignation? And also, how would you characterize the South Yemen regime under the PLF?
Thanks. Maybe one more, and then we'll.
Thanks for great talks. This is addressed to both of you, but I'll put it to Gavin because of the citation of Gramsci. It seems to me that most of what you were addressing were Gramsci's sort of second mode of translation, carrying theoretical claims to different singular, diverse situations. I'm wondering if any of the thinkers that you're working with have interesting things to say, however, about that first mode of translating concrete situations to theory. what about when there isn't an adequate or even inadequate theory to translate? And so then the epistemological question is what's a concrete situation? What's the real? What's being translated into theory if it's not sort of an empiricism and representation of sense experience? I think for Marx, translating is something else, right? It's translating the language of commodities it's something we can't hear. What Coates are saying to Lenin has to be, it's precisely not empiricist. We don't hear that language. So we have to get to the translation somehow else. Anyway, that's Marx. But what about some of the people that you're working with?
So maybe I'll bring it back here and we'll do one more round. I think we have time, right?
Sure, I can start. I'll keep it brief because I'm very eager to hear what you all have to say. So if there's another round of questions, that'd be great. What I would say, I think I'm, in regards to the first question, I think I'm generally in agreement, and it's really an issue of time rather than a divergence. That the aspect you highlight, I think, is an extension of the argument I'm trying to present, in the sense that the notion that if indigenous Maya cosmology is taken as a worldview with its own universal concepts, then it has to be treated in a kind of reciprocal fashion that you were suggesting alongside Marxism. And that would mean that it's not the specific language or tongue, say, to use Gramsci's language, it's not the tongue of southeastern Mexico, if that's what the confines of the concrete situation are in that specific analysis, but rather a system of thought that can travel as well. Doesn't travel as much, but in a sense, it has actually traveled without much of us very aware of it, because although we don't, a lot of people I was around whenever, here in New York, whenever Occupy started up, and El mundo que queremos es uno donde quepan muchos mundos was in fact a phrase circulating, and that phrase does relate back to Maya cosmology. So whether or not people knew it or not, they were translating themselves through their indigenous Maya ideas in that way. So you could extend the argument in that direction as well. And that sort of takes me to what I would say about concrete situations and this question of this first form of the title, Marxism as translation, Marxism as the method of translating historical life into theory or a theoretical language. Mariátegui, who I mentioned, has a really long, complicated theorization of this question. But I think both of them, on some level, take for granted what a concrete situation means, and so in the presentation, I could potentially take it for granted as well. And a lot of potential, I had anticipated this question more along the lines of the national, so that for Gramsci, it's really about like Italy, Russia, so forth, and that in some sense, that's what the concrete situation is nationally framed, and so maybe that wouldn't be very helpful for today, but the presentation tries to anticipate that by saying, well, for the Zapatistas, it's about the mountains of southeastern Mexico, which is clearly not a nationally defined situation. But I think it's an important question that I'm not sure. It's something I'll think about more. I don't think that, I think for the most part, the figures I use take for granted what concrete situation means, rather than delving into whether or not there's a kind of hidden empiricism to what they're talking about. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for your questions. I'm going to be very brief. I mean, I cannot address the Algeria and the Yemen question, as you may understand now, but I'll say something about, after Ben Bella, but I'll say something about what's happening in Algeria now, which I think is very interesting, because it sort of calls into question the whole, it calls into question the question of basically when does an event start, when does an event basically end, right? Because now, after there are massive mobilizations in Sudan and Algeria, people are saying, oh, the Arab Spring is not done, but then they were saying like, oh, Arab Spring, Islamist winter. So, but this is not only, this is not only a critique of Eurocentric media stuff, it's also in the Arab world. But so it actually, there's a question here of thinking about the duration of an emancipatory event and the different things. Now that has a second aspect to it as well, because there's all these discourses circulating, either by sort of the Syrian revolutionaries or Egyptian revolutionaries to the Algerians, and like in conversation with them about sort of like telling them, don't fall for the trick of the military, for example, or the other way around, Algerians who are saying, we are not going to repeat this scenario, And a footnote on this question of scenarios is very interesting, because there's a strand in the Marxist tradition which does not call for translation, but assumes full commensurability, which I didn't talk about, which is the language of models and scenarios, which was very, very prominent. And the people I work with basically pushed translation against the language of models, because the language of models, especially when you have a military revolutionary struggle, is very attractive, because you're like, okay, you're in Lebanon, should you apply the Vietnamese model, which assumes full commensurability, or should we even apply, the Chinese model? So that question is something interesting to think about. I think your question is great. And I think, unlike Gavin, I don't think people trip on what made the Marxists in the Arab world trip by the question of concreteness is not cosmologies. In the 80s, there was an Islamic left. It's very easy to imagine a Jewish Marxism, a Christian Marxism, and Islamic Marxism. And these existed. Where they tripped is on the problem of community. Ethnic, sectarian, regional. And the problem of community is not equivalent to the problem of religious cosmologies, i.e. secular, religious, etc. Like, there's a village that basically hates the other village because they're from a different family. Like, no possibility of subsumption here. You can't have that. And so the question of capital's forces of conceptual subsumption were basically faced the logic of community. So people tried to explain that by sort of like using Marxist formal subsumption. People in the Arab world, that then Harry Hartunian did later on with Marx after Marx in different ways. So that's one way. But for me, I don't care, formal subsumption or not. I mean, it's a political problem. So the question, I think, is the question of community, not the question of cosmology and the question of religion. And you see this, if you think about liberal discourses about culture in the Arab world, and now sectarianism, you see this sort of like, this idea is there in a certain sense. So what you get, are like sort of mirror images in which you don't have individuals. Like, Frankfurt schools saying, oh, the individual is liquidated in the US because the subsumption is so strong, in the West because subsumption is so strong. And in the non-West, what you have is basically no subsumption at all. You have culture, and therefore you have pre-individuals. So there is no mediation between theory and practice. And I think that has always been the problem of Marxism in the Arab world, how to think the question of community, not the question of religion.
Lunch is almost upon us, but so I think what we have time for are like questions without answers. So I think we could take maybe like 2 more questions/comments, which can then be folded into the larger conversation. I know Susan, did somebody else want to? Maybe we can come like 1, 2 right here. Yeah, exactly. So the 2. No, it's okay. I mean, I think.
No, it's just.
Yes. Okay. So I think 2 of you.
Okay. So I'm really trying here. Really trying. Because I appreciate your work so much, but there is this, and it's going to sound bad in a way. I'll try not to make it sound bad because I don't mean it in the bad way, but let me keep trying. Okay, and that is, let me ask it this way: what would be success? We've already been told 2 things might be success. One is world revolution, either. The model, not the model, the Marxist, okay, here's how it starts. It's a Marxist tradition. It's one that all of my life, and it's pretty long, I've never been recognized within. I feel like a third world person. I've never been recognized within that. I'm not talking about Marxist feminism, et cetera, but I am talking about Marxist feminists who I know who have just been blown off because it's a secondary contradiction. But I don't want to go there. What I want to go to is this. What would be success? We've already been told 2 or 3 things. One is history, winning in history victors don't make you right. Okay, absolutely agree. Hegel's wrong. Okay, that's the first one. The second one, somehow the goal is a world revolution, I guess. The problem is, how does theory relate to movements, I guess. I think the strength of you as academics doing that is that you really do articulate for academics what can be understood to be going on. So it's a way of working within the academy of transforming ideology into something that would have a critical edge. But I sense this other role that supposedly is being played, which is to actually be the avant-garde. Get it right, translate so that movements happen, and then what? They're successful? Well, that doesn't mean that they were right. They're unsuccessful? Well, that doesn't necessarily mean they're bourgeois or liberal or anything else. So, like, there's something missing for me. Is it just the capacity to say Marx is what we're talking about, now let's talk within that tradition, or is something else going on?
So I can't be that profound, so I'm going to. First of all, thank you very much for both of you. Mike, I don't know if it's a comment or a question or a question. It's for Fadi. I mean, I'm just because I'm particularly interested in that region and everything. Like, I mean, not only do I agree with it, but I just absolutely loved your talk. I mean, I was like, we have to talk more. I want to take this question of community very seriously here, because I think this is, it's something I've been trying to articulate in the context of Pakistan as well. I mean, for instance, what's a polity, right? What's community? How do you actually imagine social transformation within the context of these riven societies where precisely the kind of divisions that you're talking about get invoked all the time, secularism, non-secular, right? I mean, I was just in Pakistan twice this year. One of the things that struck me incredibly was how a certain discursive framing from the West, from America, has completely taken over. And by the way, we were part of, my comrades here were part of the primary versus secondary contradiction fight with Vijay over precisely some of these questions. But the discursive framing that's taken over is precisely that of, like, Islam is the problem versus liberalism, right? I mean, whereas some of the real questions are state centralization, ethnic divisions, right? Sectarianism, yes, but sectarianism within the very question of, well, what precisely is society today? In this particular context, I'll just say Islamic countries, right? I mean, but just because I'm trying to narrow it down, right? And that's a question for Pakistan as much as it is, I think, for Syria, and also that this multipolar kind of, proxy stuff that's going on now. I mean, in Balochistan, everyone's there. China's there, India's there, the Qataris are there, UAE is there, and we don't, and maybe this does relate to Susan's question of the future, we don't even know at this point what exactly we're fighting, how to fight for what we're fighting for, especially given that China's also arrived full-time across the state. So how do we imagine community? How do we imagine polity? And how do we imagine a future, since we're talking about futures as well, given that we don't actually know, right, what precisely a future could look like right now, if that makes sense, I don't know.
Wonderful questions, and we're going to let them marinate. No, I mean, the conversation continues.